When my 13-year-old son heard the sirens that night, he ran to the basement door. The music production studio he'd spent 4 years building was already filling with smoke. My wife's brother had deliberately set the fire in the corner where we stored the equipment, a setup worth $92,000 that our son had assembled piece by piece, learning everything from YouTube tutorials and online courses. The investigator would later show me the evidence: accelerant patterns, timing markers, the deliberate placement near the high-value components. When I saw the photographs, I didn't scream. I didn't rage. I calmly walked to my son's room, sat next to him on the edge of his bed, and said, "Your uncle did this because he needed $50,000 and thought our insurance would cover it." My son looked at me, and I knew he was waiting to hear that I was wrong, that this wasn't really happening, that family didn't do things like this. But there was something he didn't know yet. There was something nobody in my family knew, and in the next 72 hours, everything would change in ways they couldn't have imagined. Let me tell you how we got here. Let me explain the years of being invisible, the comments that cut deeper than people realized, the way my accomplishments were always dismissed as luck or timing or help from someone else. To understand this moment, you need to understand what came before, not just the fire, but the long, quiet accumulation of evidence that nobody was paying attention to who I really was. I grew up in a family where being the middle daughter meant being the forgotten one. My older sister, Patricia, got all the attention from the start. She was beautiful in a way that made people stop talking when she entered a room. Everyone wanted to know what Patricia was doing, where Patricia was going, who Patricia was dating. My younger brother Michael got the sympathy vote. He struggled in school, had some behavioral issues when he was a teenager, and somehow that meant he needed constant support and attention. And then there was me. I was fine. I was always fine. I had good grades, but not exceptional enough to be the smart one. I had friends, but I wasn't the popular one. I played soccer, but I wasn't the athletic one. I was just competent and steady and invisible. My parents didn't mean to make me feel this way. They were good people, genuinely good. But they operated on the assumption that the people who needed help were the ones who asked for it, and I learned very early that asking for help made you seem needy. By the time I was 16, I'd internalized the message: take care of yourself, don't burden anyone, and for God's sake, don't brag about anything you accomplish because that makes you insufferable. My mother would say things like, "I'm so glad you're independent. You've always been so self-sufficient," which sounded like a compliment until you realized it meant nobody thought you needed anything from them, which meant nobody was really invested in what happened to you. The summer after my high school graduation, my father had one of his famous family dinners where everyone sat around the dining room table and reported on their lives. Patricia had just gotten engaged to a man she'd been dating for 3 months. He was handsome and had a good job at a law firm. Everyone was thrilled. Michael had just been accepted to a state university with a partial scholarship. Everyone was proud. When my parents asked about my summer job, I mentioned that I'd been offered a position at the accounting firm where I was interning, and they wanted me to start full-time in September even though I wouldn't start college until the following year. My mother smiled and said, "That's nice, honey. You should do it for a year and see if you like it." That was it. Nice. Like I'd mentioned, I was thinking about adopting a cat. By that point, though, something inside me had already shifted. I was tired of being the invisible one. I was tired of accomplishments that nobody noticed. And I made a decision that August, sitting in my childhood bedroom looking at the acceptance letters I'd received from 3 colleges that my parents had barely glanced at. I was going to build something so undeniable, so concrete, so obviously successful that nobody would ever be able to dismiss it as luck or timing or coincidence. I started at the accounting firm in September of 2001, right after the attacks on the World Trade Center. It was a chaotic time for everyone in finance, but I was 22 years old and hungry in a way I'd never been before. I worked 80-hour weeks. I studied for my CPA license while working full-time. I passed the exam on my first attempt in 2004 at the age of 25, and when I told my family at Christmas dinner that year, my brother Michael asked me what a CPA actually did. My mother mentioned that my Aunt Dorothy's husband was a CPA, and wasn't that nice that we had that in common? I'd spent 2 years studying for that exam, and my family's response was to compare me to an uncle by marriage they barely saw. By 2007, I was a senior accountant at Patterson and Associates, making $97,000 a year. I just bought my first condo in the Marina District, paid 80% of the purchase price in cash using money I'd saved, and financed the rest at a rate that would have made most first-time homebuyers jealous. When I mentioned it at a family dinner, my sister Patricia immediately went into real estate mode. She'd gotten a broker's license the year before, and she started asking me questions about the property like she was helping me navigate a major decision, when in reality I'd already negotiated the deal, done the inspection, secured the mortgage, and was 3 weeks from closing. "You should really think about getting a better inspector," she said, even though I'd already used the inspector she would have recommended and gotten a full report. My mother added, "That's a nice neighborhood, but you might have trouble with the commute to work." I'd been calculating commute times for 6 months. The commute was 15 minutes on BART or 30 minutes driving depending on traffic. There was this pattern, you see, where my family believed I was making decisions without enough information, without enough help, without enough foresight. They didn't mean it as an insult. They meant it as concern. But concern that assumes incompetence is just contempt dressed up in family obligation. The real shift came in 2009. The economy was collapsing, and I was watching firms go under around me. I was at Patterson and Associates, and our senior partners were making terrible decisions, clients were jumping ship, and I could see the firm was heading toward structural problems. I'd been there for 8 years, and I had access to information most junior people didn't. I could see which clients were unhappy, who was thinking about leaving, what their pain points were. I had relationships with at least 60% of our client base because they specifically requested me for their work. In February of 2009, I made my first big move without telling my family. I registered an LLC called Marina Financial Services. I spent $3,000 on the registration, business license, insurance, website, and basic marketing materials. I told my family I was thinking about consulting on the side, which was technically true, but I didn't mention that I'd already started reaching out to clients, and I didn't mention that by March, I had 3 of Patterson's most important accounts interested in moving their business to me. That's when I realized I had to make a decision. I could stay at Patterson and be the reliable senior accountant who kept the firm running, the person everyone depended on but nobody really saw, or I could leave and build something that was completely and undeniably mine. On March 15, 2009, I gave notice. 2 weeks later, I left with 3 clients generating approximately $23,000 in monthly revenue. By April, I'd moved my office, a small rented space in a building on Battery Street that cost $1,500 a month, and I'd hired my first employee, a junior accountant named David Chen who'd been working under me at Patterson and who wanted to take the risk with me. During this entire period, I said nothing to my family. Nothing. My mother called asking if Patterson had let me go. I said I'd decided to pursue other opportunities. She said, "Oh, that's nice. Will you be able to find another firm that's hiring right now?" The economy was in free fall, and she assumed I'd be job hunting. I let her think that. Why? Because explaining that I was starting a business would have triggered a barrage of concerns and unsolicited advice and worried phone calls and family opinions about my financial stability. It was easier to let them think I was uncertain than to deal with their reaction to my certainty. By 2010, Marina Financial Services was bringing in $240,000 annually in revenue. By 2011, we had 6 employees and were servicing 47 accounts. By 2013, revenue had crossed the $1 million mark, and my family still thought I was working some kind of mid-level accounting job. The invisibility had become intentional. It was a shield. As long as nobody knew how successful I was becoming, nobody could take it away from me. Nobody could diminish it. Nobody could explain it as luck or good timing or help from someone else. It existed in the space between my ears and my bank account, and it was real. My marriage to David, my second employee David's brother, not to be confused with the accountant David, happened in 2012. It was a quiet ceremony with just immediate family. My mother's comment to relatives afterward was, "She married a good man." I was worried she'd be single forever, being so career-focused. David was standing right there. I was standing right there. We both heard it. And I said nothing because that's what I'd learned to do. David knew about the business, obviously. He was there from the beginning, watching me build it, but even he didn't know the full scope of what I was doing. He didn't know I'd been saving 60% of my income, that I'd purchased a second property in 2011 for cash, that I'd started an investment portfolio that was now worth $430,000. He knew the outline, but not the architecture. The architecture was mine alone. My brother Michael, the one who struggled in school, who everyone worried about, had become a moderately successful real estate developer. Nothing terrible, nothing spectacular. He was doing okay financially, but he wanted to be doing better. And in 2015, he started asking the family for money. Not directly, at first, but there would be comments at family dinners about how expensive property development was, how tight cash flow could be, how he was looking for investors. My mother started making comments about how nice it would be if someone in the family could help him expand his business. My father mentioned, in passing, that Michael's business could really take off with the right support. And I said nothing. Because the second I revealed that I had money, the second I acknowledged that I could help, the entire family dynamic would shift. I would become the person with resources, which meant I would become the person with responsibility, which meant I would become the person everyone turned to. I'd watched this happen with my parents. I'd watched my father work himself to exhaustion to be the financial safety net for everyone. I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to set myself up as the family bank, the one everyone could extract resources from when their own plans didn't work out. In 2016, my sister Patricia called me with a proposal. She'd gotten divorced from the handsome lawyer, and she was starting fresh. She wanted to open a boutique real estate agency specializing in luxury properties. She wanted to know if I could help her get started. By help, she meant would I loan her $60,000. She said it as though it was a small thing, a sisterly favor, something I should obviously be able to do if I really loved her. I told her I didn't have that kind of liquid cash available, which was technically a lie. I had liquid cash. I just wasn't going to spend it on a venture I didn't believe in, run by my sister who didn't have the track record to make it work. She didn't call me back for 3 months after that conversation. My mother actually brought it up at one of our family dinners in April. "Patricia is really struggling right now," she said, looking at me. "I know you're not in a position to help, but if you ever get your finances in order, she could really use a brother." My brother, she meant. She said brother, but she meant me. The slip revealed what she was really thinking. I was failing in my familial duty because I wasn't sharing my resources. Never mind that I'd never claimed to have those resources. Never mind that Patricia hadn't asked me directly in months. The fact that I was capable and not contributing made me the failure. But then something happened that changed everything. Michael came to the house in July of 2016, and he was with someone I'd never seen before. My mother introduced him as Richard Brennan, and she said he was an advisor of sorts. Michael looked nervous, and over the course of that dinner, it became clear that Richard Brennan was helping Michael with a major property development deal. They were planning to build a luxury residential community 40 miles outside the city, and the projected revenue was enormous. My father kept asking questions about the financing, and Michael kept being vague, and Richard kept jumping in with technical answers that sounded competent but weren't quite reassuring. I said nothing, but I was doing mental math. The project was going to cost minimum $8 million to develop. Michael didn't have that. The family didn't have that. And yet here was Richard Brennan, this smooth operator in an expensive suit, talking about how this project would change Michael's life. I'd seen this before. I worked with clients who'd been talked into bad deals by advisors. This smelled like it. After dinner, I pulled Michael aside. "Is this real?" I asked him. "Are you actually going into this with this guy?" "He's legit," Michael said. "He's done this before. He just needs some initial capital to get the project moving, and then the returns will." "How much initial capital?" I asked. $250,000, he said. My stomach dropped. Michael didn't have $250,000, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that he was planning to ask my parents for it. Or worse, he was planning to ask me for it while pretending he wasn't. I didn't tell anyone what I thought. I went home, and I had David pull the background check on Richard Brennan, and we discovered that he had 3 civil lawsuits filed against him in other states, all involving real estate deals that had gone bad. 2 of them had investor losses listed as the basis. I printed out the documents and left them on Michael's doorstep in a manila envelope with a note that said, "Do your homework before you lose everything." Michael never acknowledged that I'd sent them, but he also never mentioned Richard Brennan again. And my mother, who'd clearly been getting invested in the idea of this big development project that would make Michael successful, called me one evening in a voice that suggested she thought I'd sabotaged the whole thing. "Michael says he's not moving forward with that advisor anymore," she said. "Did you say something to him?" "I sent him some public records," I said. "He can make his own decisions." "Well, he seems very upset about something," she said, "but nobody asked me directly. Nobody said thank you. Nobody acknowledged that I'd possibly saved Michael from losing the family money. It just became another thing I did that disappeared into the silence between what I accomplished and what anyone noticed." By 2018, Marina Financial Services was bringing in just over $2 million in annual revenue. I had 15 employees. We'd relocated to a bigger office in the financial district. My personal net worth was somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.6 million, and I just purchased a second investment property in Oakland that I was planning to renovate and flip. I was 40 years old, and I'd built everything alone, and nobody in my family had the faintest idea. That's when my wife's brother came into the picture. His name was Marcus. He was 15 years younger than my wife, which made him around 35 when I first met him properly. He was charming in that casual way that makes people trust him immediately, and he'd been drifting through various business ventures since his early 20s without landing on anything that stuck. He was the kind of person who always had an idea for something big, always knew someone who could help, always was about to make it, but never quite did. My wife had a complicated relationship with him. She loved him because he was her brother, but she'd also lent him money twice before and never been repaid. In early 2019, Marcus showed up at one of our family dinners with a new venture. He was going into cryptocurrency trading. He'd partnered with a former college friend who understood blockchain technology, and they were going to launch a fund that would generate returns of 15 to 20% monthly. He said this with the confidence of someone who'd done no research and didn't understand that returns of that magnitude were impossible. My father asked some questions. Marcus deflected with technical jargon. My mother looked impressed. And then Marcus looked at me. "You're the finance person," he said. "What do you think?" I felt everyone at the table turn toward me. This was the moment where I could finally reveal that I knew something about business, about finance, about risk. I could say, "Actually, I run a business," and suddenly I wouldn't be invisible anymore. I wouldn't be the person people asked polite questions to before moving on to someone more interesting. I could be the person with answers, and I thought about what would happen next. I thought about the conversations that would follow. "Why didn't you tell us you were so successful? Don't you think you could have helped the family? Your mother and I would have liked to have known." And then there would be the requests. Subtle at first, then more direct. "Since you understand finance, you could probably help Marcus get this off the ground. Family should support family." So instead of revealing anything, I said, "I'm not really in the crypto space. You want to talk to someone who specializes in that." Marcus nodded, clearly disappointed that I couldn't validate his ideas. My mother said, "Well, it sounds very exciting." And that was that. But I watched. I'd learned to watch. And over the next 18 months, I tracked Marcus's cryptocurrency venture from a distance. He invested around $40,000, money that appeared to come from small loans and advances on his credit cards. The venture collapsed in late 2019, which wasn't surprising because cryptocurrency crashed and also because the partner was a scammer. Marcus lost it all. He didn't even seem particularly upset about it. He just moved on to the next idea. But something shifted for me during that period. I realized I'd been holding myself back out of caution, and the caution had become a cage. I'd built a successful business that nobody knew about. I had wealth that nobody acknowledged. I had expertise that nobody asked for. And the reason was that I was afraid of becoming a resource instead of a person, of being valued for what I could provide rather than who I was. But the alternative was to remain invisible. And I was tired of being invisible. In September of 2019, I made the decision to start revealing pieces of what I'd built. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but gradually. I started mentioning client wins at family dinners. I casually mentioned a property investment I'd made. When my mother asked what I was doing at work, I said, growing a business, instead of vaguely talking around it. I was testing the waters, seeing how people would react. The reactions were mixed. My sister Patricia asked pointed questions about my real estate investments that bordered on interrogation. I think she was trying to figure out how much money I had. My brother Michael asked very carefully if I was doing okay financially, which was code for asking if I could help him, but he didn't quite have the courage to ask directly. My mother seemed almost offended that I'd been running a successful business without consulting her on how to do it. My father, who'd built his own career through steady work and careful choices, asked smart questions about growth strategy and client retention. And Marcus, who'd watched all of this, became very interested in me, not in a romantic way. In a predatory way, though I didn't see it that clearly at first. He started asking me questions about my business. He wanted to know about my clients, my revenue, my margins. He'd call and suggest getting lunch or coffee so we could talk business. He started mentioning new ventures he was thinking about and asking if I thought they were viable. He was circling, trying to figure out how to access whatever I had. I didn't say no to him directly. I just became less available. I gave shorter answers. I stopped inviting him to things, but my wife kept wanting me to spend time with him, kept saying he needed mentoring, kept suggesting that as her brother I should help him. And there's something about that kind of pressure. When your spouse is suggesting you should do more for her family, that makes you question whether you're being unfair. In early 2020, right when the pandemic started, Marcus asked my wife if he could borrow $50,000. He said it was for an investment opportunity that had just come up, and if the timing was right, it could generate serious returns. He needed an answer within a week. My wife came to me with it. "Can we help him?" she asked. "No," I said. "He's my brother," she said. "He wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." "That's exactly why we shouldn't do it," I said. "Because he would ask. Because he asks everyone. Because he's not able to say no to himself, which means he can't manage money responsibly." "You don't know that," she said. But I did know it. I knew it from the cryptocurrency disaster. I knew it from the pattern I'd observed over years of him approaching various family members at family dinners with requests and ideas. And I told my wife we would not be lending him $50,000. We would not be lending him any amount. I made it clear that this was not negotiable. She was angry with me about it. She said I was being selfish. She said I didn't understand what it was like to have a sibling you loved who was struggling. She said, "If you're so successful, why wouldn't you help him?" And there it was, the exact dynamic I'd been afraid of from the beginning. As soon as I had resources, I became obligated to distribute them according to other people's needs. Marcus responded to being denied the money with characteristic charm. He called me, said he understood my position, said he respected my financial caution. He asked if maybe I could introduce him to someone at my firm who might be able to advise him on a smaller venture. I said I would think about it, and then I didn't do it. The funny thing is, that should have been the end of it. Marcus should have moved on to whatever the next idea was. But something happened during the pandemic that changed everything. My business boomed. With everyone working from home, companies suddenly needed the exact services that Marina Financial Services provided. Virtual accounting infrastructure, remote tax planning, digital financial systems. We went from $2 million in annual revenue to $4.6 million in 2020. In 2021, we hit $7.8 million. I doubled my staff. I opened a second office. I bought a third property in Marin County. And somehow, despite my efforts to keep it quiet, word was getting out. My sister Patricia, who'd started that luxury real estate agency in 2016 with money from somewhere, I still don't know where, suddenly got very interested in my real estate investments. She'd mention properties she thought I should buy. She'd call with advice about markets. She'd casually mention financial advisors she knew who could help me manage my wealth. What she really wanted was to be seen as someone I valued and consulted with to have a role in my success. My brother Michael, who'd gone back to steady work in property development after the Richard Brennan incident, started asking me specific questions about my business model. How did I charge clients? What was my profit margin? How many employees did I need to reach a certain revenue threshold? He was conducting what amounted to industrial espionage, trying to understand how to replicate what I'd built. And my parents, who'd spent years giving me advice about being self-sufficient, suddenly had strong opinions about what I should do with my money. My father suggested I should be thinking about estate planning. My mother mentioned that it must be stressful to handle everything alone and maybe I should consider bringing in professional management. They were trying to position themselves as guides in my success, as though they'd been there all along. But Marcus was different. Marcus was watching, and he was waiting, and he was thinking about how to make my success become his opportunity. In late 2021, my son was born. His name was Joshua, and he arrived in November of that year. He was the light of my life, he still is, and having him changed my perspective on things in ways I didn't expect. I'd spent so many years building something, and suddenly I wanted him to see it. I wanted him to understand that his mother had built something real, something that created security for him. I wanted him to know that you don't have to be the loudest person in the room to accomplish things. Joshua was fascinated by music from a very young age. Even before he could talk clearly, he'd hum along to songs. By age 4, he was asking about instruments. By age 5, he wanted to learn piano. By age 7, he'd expanded to wanting to learn production, not just playing music, but creating it, understanding how it worked at a technical level. And I, who'd learned the hard way that building something requires solitude and focus, and the ability to work without recognition, supported him completely. I set up a small studio space in our basement. I bought him a basic setup. And I watched him pour himself into learning how to make music in exactly the same way I'd poured myself into building my business. Marcus took notice. At family dinners, he'd ask Joshua about the studio. He'd ask what equipment we'd invested in. He'd joke about how expensive music production equipment was. And then, in early 2023, he started dropping comments about the studio's value. "Man, all that gear must be worth a fortune," he'd say. "You could probably insure that for what, 70 grand? 80? He was doing valuations. He was thinking about the studio as an asset. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything. This was my pattern, after all. I'd learned to observe without commenting, to gather information without revealing what I knew. Then, in the spring of 2023, Marcus came to me directly. He was no longer being subtle. He told me he needed to borrow $50,000. Again. 3 years after the first request. He said he was getting involved in a business opportunity with some people he knew, and he needed capital to make it work. He said this time it was real. He said he understood why I'd said no before, but this was different. I said no again. And this time, I didn't hedge it or soften it. I said, "Marcus, I've watched you cycle through ventures for years. Every single time someone loses money, usually you, sometimes people who loved you. I'm not going to be one of those people. The answer is no, it will always be no." He looked at me for a long moment. And then he nodded, and then he said something that I didn't realize at the time was a threat. "I understand," he said. "I respect that. I hope your luck holds out with everything you've built." Luck, he said, luck, not skill. He said luck, not work. And then he walked away. That comment haunted me. I mentioned it to David that evening, and he said I was overthinking it, that Marcus was just being Marcus, that he'd move on to something else. And I wanted to believe that. But I've spent years reading people, and I knew what I'd heard. I knew what that comment meant. He was angry. He was humiliated. And he was thinking about how to take something from me. For the next 6 months, I waited for something to happen. I increased the security on my house. I made sure all my important documents were in a safe. I had David check our insurance policies. I told my business partner to be careful about what information we shared with anyone outside the company. I was in a constant state of low-level alert, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Joshua, meanwhile, was flourishing with his music. By age 12, he'd invested roughly $15,000 of his own money, birthday gifts, money he'd made doing tech support for neighbors, small freelance gigs. He'd bought high-end equipment. He'd taught himself production software. His studio wasn't just a hobby space, it was professional grade. And he used it. He created beats. He produced tracks. He was good at it. He had a following on SoundCloud of a few hundred people. He was starting to get paid small amounts for production work. On the evening of December 16, 2023, my son heard the sirens. He ran downstairs to the basement to check on his equipment, and the fire was already spreading from the corner where we kept the most expensive gear. The fire department was there in minutes. They contained it to the basement. Nothing else in the house caught, but the studio was gone, all of it. Everything he'd built over 4 years. The insurance investigator came 2 days later. He spent hours in that basement taking photographs and measurements, and then he came into my office and showed me the evidence. The accelerant was in a specific pattern. The fire had started in a corner that didn't contain any electrical equipment that could have sparked a natural fire. The starting point showed deliberate placement. And the most damning evidence, a half-empty container of charcoal lighter fluid found in the hedges outside the basement window, with Marcus's fingerprints on it. The investigator told me the fire was arson. He told me he was recommending criminal charges, and he told me he suspected the motive had something to do with insurance fraud. The homeowner's insurance would cover the equipment at replacement value, and Marcus needed $50,000. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel shock. I felt cold, crystalline clarity. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. This was the moment that was going to change everything. I sat down next to my son, who'd been watching cartoons in a daze, processing the loss of his life's work, and I told him the truth about his uncle. I told him that sometimes people do inexplicable things when they're desperate. I told him that what happened wasn't his fault, and it wasn't a reflection of his worth, and it didn't mean anything about his future. I told him that I was going to handle it, and then I called my lawyer. Everything that happened next was something I'd actually been preparing for, even if I didn't know it at the time. I'd spent 20 years building something undeniable. I'd spent 20 years gathering evidence of my competence and my success. I'd spent 20 years creating documentation of every achievement, every financial transaction, every business decision. And I'd done it in a way that left no room for anyone to diminish it or explain it away. My lawyer, Rebecca Chen, listened to my story and pulled up the insurance claim file. She told me that the investigator's report was already in the system, and the insurance company was flagging the claim as suspicious. She told me that the criminal charges would likely follow within weeks. And she told me something else. Marcus had borrowed money from a predatory lender in November. He owed $58,000, and it was due before New Year's. The fire timing made perfect sense. He was desperate, and he thought destroying my son's equipment would trigger an insurance payout that would solve his problem. "Here's what we're going to do," Rebecca said. "We're going to wait for the police to make their move. We're going to cooperate fully with their investigation. And then, when the timing is right, we're going to make sure this is made public in a way that ensures your family understands exactly what happened and why." "I want him prosecuted," I said. "I want him in prison." "He probably will be," Rebecca said. "Insurance fraud plus arson, that's serious time. But before that happens, there's something else you're going to do." "What?" I asked. "You're going to tell your family the truth," she said. "About all of it. About your business. About your success. About your wealth. Because the second they know what you've built, the second they understand what Marcus destroyed, the optics of this entire situation change. Right now, if this goes public without context, people are going to wonder why Marcus needed money so badly. They might sympathize with him. But if your family knows what you've accomplished, if they understand the scope of what Marcus tried to take from you, it changes the narrative entirely." I listened to Rebecca, and I understood what she was really saying. It was time to stop being invisible. It was time to stand up. The police arrested Marcus on December 28th, based on the fingerprint evidence and the accelerant analysis. The charges were arson, attempted insurance fraud, and property destruction. His bail was set at $25,000, which he couldn't afford, so he was held pending trial. The story made it into the local news, not the main story, but it was there. Local man arrested for arson in family dispute. And then my wife told her parents, and her parents told my parents, and within 48 hours the entire family knew. My mother called me. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did Marcus really try to burn down your house?" "He burned down my son's equipment," I said. "The arson was contained to the basement. And yes, the evidence is pretty clear." "My God," she said, "I don't understand. Why would he do that?" And that was the moment. That was the moment I'd been waiting for, and I told her. I told her that Marcus had asked me for $50,000. I told her I'd said no. I told her that when I said no, he became angry. And I told her that he'd apparently decided that if I wouldn't give him money, he'd destroy something valuable enough that insurance would provide it. "But why would he think that would work?" my mother asked. "Because," I said, "he didn't think I had the resources to pursue this legally. He thought I'd be grateful for the insurance payout. He didn't realize what I've actually built." There was a long pause, and then my mother said, "What do you mean?" And I told her. I told her about Marina Financial Services. I told her about the revenue. I told her about the properties. I told her about the net worth. I told her about the fact that I'd built a business that generated $7.8 million in annual revenue, and I'd done it alone. I told her that I'd done it despite the subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions that I wasn't capable of it, that I needed help, that I should be grateful for other people's advice and support. I told her that Marcus's move wasn't about needing $50,000. It was about desperation and entitlement and the assumption that he could take what he wanted from people he loved because family obligated them to let him. My mother didn't respond right away. And when she did, she said, "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because," I said, "the second I did, it would stop being my success and start being a family resource. And I wasn't going to let that happen again." That night, my father called me, not to lecture, not to give advice, but to ask if I needed anything. Not if I needed advice, not if I needed help with decisions, if I needed anything. It was the first time he'd asked me that without the assumption that I didn't have access to help. I said, "No, but thank you for asking." The family gathering happened on January 14th, 2024. It wasn't planned as a confrontation. My mother had invited everyone over for a dinner, and she'd mentioned it was to talk about what was happening with Marcus. I suspected what was really happening. My mother had processed the information I'd given her, and she was going to force a conversation with the entire family present. I brought David and Joshua with me. Joshua was still processing the loss of his studio, but I wanted him there. I wanted him to see what happened next. I wanted him to understand that when someone tries to take something from you, you don't just accept it, you do something about it. My father was already there when we arrived. Patricia and her current boyfriend. Michael and his wife. My mother, of course, and I noticed that Marcus had not been invited, which told me something significant about how my mother was positioning this. We sat down around the dining room table, the same table where, for years, I'd listened to conversations about other people's successes and struggles, the same table where I'd been invisible. My mother opened the conversation. "I've asked everyone here because something happened that affects all of us," she said. "Marcus burned down Joshua's equipment in our basement. He's facing criminal charges, and I've learned some things about what's been happening that I think we all need to discuss." "This is insane," my father said. "Marcus has always been irresponsible, but this is beyond anything." "Let me finish," my mother said, and I was struck by the authority in her voice. She'd always been someone's support. She'd never been someone's authority figure, but she was now. "What I've learned," my mother continued, "is that your sister," she was looking at Michael and Patricia, "has built a very successful business that none of us knew about. And when Marcus found out that she had resources, and when she said no to his request for money, he decided to destroy her son's property in what appears to be an attempt to generate an insurance payout." Patricia looked at me. "You have a business," she asked. "What kind of business?" "Accounting and financial services," I said. $7.8 million in annual revenue last year. 43 employees across 2 offices. I've been running it since 2009. The silence that followed was complete. Michael literally put down his fork. Patricia's boyfriend looked confused, like he was trying to understand if he'd heard correctly. "Why didn't you tell us?" Patricia asked, and there was something in her voice that I recognized. It was the tone she used when she felt left out, when she felt like someone else had something she didn't. "Because," I said, "the moment I told you, it would stop being my business and start being a family resource. And I've worked too hard to build this, to have it become leverage for people asking me for money or advice or help." "Is that what this is about?" Michael asked. "Marcus asked you for money and you said no, so he burned down the studio." "He asked for $50,000, I said. I said no, repeatedly. He owed that much to a predatory lender, and he was desperate. And he apparently thought that if he destroyed something valuable enough, the insurance payout would get him out of his situation." "Jesus," Michael said, and he actually looked pale. He actually tried to frame it as an accident. "The arson investigator found his fingerprints on the lighter fluid container," I said. "It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate." My father leaned back in his chair. "What do you need from us?" he asked. It was such a simple question, and it was exactly the right question. "Nothing," I said. "I've already contacted my lawyer. The police investigation is moving forward. Marcus is facing serious charges. What I'm telling you is the context you deserve to have. Because I've realized that I've been invisible in this family for a long time, and I'm not going to be invisible anymore. Patricia was looking at me like she was calculating something. So you're wealthy? She asked. Yes, I said. I have a net worth of approximately $3.2 million. I own 3 properties. I have investment accounts and retirement savings and business equity. I've built something substantial. And you never thought to mention this? Patricia's tone was sharp now, accusatory. No, I said, and I'm not going to apologize for it. I built something that's completely mine, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life managing other people's expectations about what I should do with it. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, she said, and I felt something release inside of me. I felt something that had been locked down for 20 years finally let go. I want to be clear about something, I continued, and I was looking at Patricia and Michael both. The reason Marcus thought he could do this, the reason he thought he could destroy something valuable and get away with it, is because he underestimated me. All of you have. You've underestimated me for years. You've assumed I needed help, that I wasn't capable, that I'd be grateful for advice and support. You've been kind about it, but it's the same assumption every time. That's not fair, Patricia said. I've never. You have, I interrupted. You've done it repeatedly. And so have you, I looked at Michael. And so have you, I looked at my parents. Not out of malice, but out of habit, out of the assumption that the person who doesn't ask for help doesn't need it. But I've been building something this whole time. I've been building it quietly, and I've been building it alone, and I've been doing it successfully. My father nodded slowly. We didn't know, he said. No, I said. You didn't, and that was intentional on my part. But it's time you did. Because Marcus is going to trial, and it's going to be public, and it's going to be embarrassing for this family. And I need all of you to understand what happened and why, so that when people ask, you can explain it accurately. What's going to happen to him? Michael asked. Marcus, I mean, is he going to go to prison? Probably, I said. He's facing arson charges, attempted insurance fraud, and property destruction. That's serious time, but that's not my problem to solve anymore. My problem is moving forward. Joshua, who'd been silent this entire time, spoke up. I want to rebuild the studio, he said, but bigger, better. I looked at my son, and I felt something shift in me. He was 12 years old, and he'd had something precious destroyed, and his first instinct was to rebuild it. He was more like me than I'd realized. We'll rebuild it together, I said. The dinner lasted 2 more hours, but the conversation had essentially ended. Patricia asked a series of questions about my business that I answered briefly but didn't elaborate on. Michael seemed somewhat chastened, like he was recalibrating his understanding of who I was. My parents kept looking at me like they were seeing me for the first time. As we were leaving, my mother walked me to the door. I'm sorry, she said. For what? I asked. For making you feel like you had to be invisible, she said. For not seeing what you were doing. For assuming you needed help instead of asking if you'd like support. And I hugged her, and I meant it when I said, it's okay, but I need you to understand that going forward, I'm going to be visible, whether you like it or not. 2 weeks after that dinner, Marcus's preliminary hearing was held. I attended with Rebecca. The evidence was overwhelming. His fingerprints were on the lighter fluid container. The accelerant pattern showed deliberate arson. The timing matched his financial desperation perfectly. The judge ordered him held without bail pending trial, based on the severity of the charges. As Marcus was being led out of the courtroom, he looked at me, and I saw something in his face that I'd never expected to see. Not anger, not defiance, realization. He'd completely miscalculated. He'd thought I was someone he could take advantage of. He'd thought I was financially fragile. He'd thought I'd be grateful for an insurance payout. He'd thought completely wrong about everything. The trial took 3 months to resolve, and it was never really a trial. Marcus's lawyer recommended he take a plea deal before it went to jury. The DA offered 20 years for arson plus 5 for insurance fraud, with the sentences running concurrently. Marcus took it. He was sentenced in May 2024. When the judge announced the sentence, Marcus didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. 25 years meant he'd be out in his early 60s. It was better than he deserved. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything, really, except a sense of completion. Something that had been broken was now resolved. Something that had been taken was now accounted for. The books balanced. After the trial, I refocused on what I'd been building. The business continued to grow. By the end of 2024, Marina Financial Services had 52 employees and was generating just over $14 million in annual revenue. I'd brought on a business partner, not a family member, who understood vision and execution. Joshua rebuilt his studio with better equipment, better soundproofing, better infrastructure. By age 13, he was doing freelance production work that was actually generating income. My relationship with my family changed after that dinner in January. Not dramatically, but noticeably. My mother started asking me about my business decisions rather than assuming I was making them wrong. My father treated me like an equal rather than someone who needed guidance. Patricia actually became a client, hiring my firm to handle accounting for her real estate business, which meant she was paying me for the expertise she used to question. Michael stopped asking for money and started asking for advice, which was progress. My wife realized that her brother had tried to destroy something precious to our family, and it shifted something in her. She became protective in a way she hadn't been before. She understood that my insistence on not lending Marcus money hadn't been cruelty, it had been wisdom. For 2 months, everything was stable. Joshua was rebuilding his studio. My business was thriving. My family was adjusting to the new reality of who I was and what I'd accomplished. I'd moved past the point of being invisible. I'd moved into the point of being undeniably present. Then yesterday, my lawyer called. Marcus had filed an appeal. Not on the grounds of ineffective counsel or procedural errors, he didn't have those. But he'd filed a motion claiming that his conviction had been obtained under duress, that he'd been pressured into the plea deal by his previous attorney, and that the evidence against him had been planted or misrepresented. Rebecca was calling to give me a heads up. "It's frivolous," she said. "He has absolutely no basis for this appeal, but the appellate court has to hear the motion. It's going to drag this out." I listened to her explain the legal process and I realized something. This wasn't over. Marcus still had options. Marcus was still trying. Marcus was still fighting. And I had a recording of him made the day before the preliminary hearing where he'd admitted to a mutual friend that he'd set the fire. The friend had been wired by the police as part of the investigation, and Marcus had thought they were in private. He'd said, "I just wanted her to help me. That was all I wanted." And when she wouldn't, I had to do something. The recording was in my safe. It had been presented at trial. It was in the case file, but it had never been made public. It had never been released to the media. And suddenly, I understood what Rebecca was really telling me. This was going to drag out. This was going to get messy again, and I had leverage that Marcus didn't expect. I pulled out the recording. I made copies. I contacted a journalist I knew at the Chronicle. I sent her the audio file along with context about the case, about Marcus's financial desperation, about the appeal. "Use it if you need to," I told her, "but only if it's relevant to the larger story you're telling." The journalist understood what I was doing. She was a smart woman, and she understood that Marcus had essentially forfeited his right to privacy when he tried to burn down my family's home. The story ran 3 days later. Local arsonist appeals conviction, fails to acknowledge guilt in recorded conversation. The appeal was withdrawn 48 hours later. Marcus's lawyer had probably realized that any appeal hearing would now include this recording being played publicly, which would destroy what little credibility he had left. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply made sure that the narrative couldn't be rewritten. I made sure that my version of events was the only one that mattered. And as I sat in my office, looking out at the city from the 42nd floor, I realized something about myself. I'd spent 20 years learning how to be invisible, and it had served me well. But I'd never learned how to be visible in a way that didn't feel like a threat. I'd never figured out how to be successful without apologizing for it, without diminishing it, without making it small enough that other people could feel comfortable around it. Marcus had tried to take something from me, and I'd responded not with anger but with strategy. I'd used every tool available to me. I'd used the law, I'd used the media, I'd used leverage, and I'd done it calmly, carefully, methodically. Some people might say I was cold about it. Some people might say I should have felt something more, relief or vindication or closure. But the truth is, I felt something else. I felt power. I felt the absolute certainty that I would never again be the person that someone could take advantage of. I felt the understanding that being invisible had made me dangerous, because nobody expects the person in the corner to be the one holding all the cards. I'd learned to build. I'd learned to accumulate. I'd learned to wait. And I'd learned that patience is the most powerful weapon available to anyone willing to use it. Marcus is currently in federal prison, serving his 25-year sentence. He's eligible for parole in 14 years. I don't think about him much anymore. What I think about is Joshua, rebuilding his studio. What I think about is the business I'm building. What I think about is the quiet satisfaction of being the person nobody expects to win.